In 2022, amid stacks of cold case files forgotten for 40 years, an unbelievable truth suddenly emerged from the shadows. The two little girls who vanished from the heart of Kansas in 1982 had not died, had not disappeared from this world, but were still alive, had grown up, and had never known they were the center of a tragedy that haunted an entire town. In an instant, their lives were torn apart when the truth was revealed. They were not children born into their current family, but two sisters who had been stolen from their biological family's arms on a seemingly harmless morning. Behind that traceless disappearance were thousands of hours of desperate searching, dead-end paths of justice, and a case sealed in silence for decades. Today, I'm going to take you straight into the heart of a story that has lasted nearly half a century. What happened in Hutchinson, Kansas in 1982, who took those two children, and how fate managed to hide them from the entire world for 40 years. This is not just a missing persons case, it is a story of stolen identities, buried truths, and the moment when modern science forced the past to speak. You are the final witnesses to this journey, so take a deep breath, because what's about to unfold will keep you glued to your screen. Before we dive into this truly shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe every buried truth deserves to be uncovered, don't forget to subscribe so you can join us on the journeys ahead. Hutchinson, Kansas in 1982 was a typical Midwestern town where a sense of safety had become a default part of daily life. Familiar low-rise streets, quiet neighborhoods, doors often left unlocked during the day, and children allowed to run and play in yards or on sidewalks without constant adult supervision, because people believed that in a small community like this, any danger would reveal itself before it could do harm. The Thomas family lived in a modest but tidy house on the edge of the residential area, not wealthy, no scandals, living a regular life in rhythm with the town. Mornings when the adults went to work, quiet afternoons, and late afternoons filled with children and short neighborly chats over low fences. Jessica Thomas, 5 years old, was beginning to have a clearer awareness of the world around her, quick and obedient, often tasked with watching her younger sister when the grown-ups were busy. Sandra Thomas, just 2 years old, almost always stayed close to her big sister, instinctively holding Jessica's hand. The bond between the two sisters wasn't just blood, it was forged through shared routines, eating together, playing together, sleeping in the same room. In the adults' eyes, leaving the two girls together was considered safe enough. The person directly watching the two children that morning was Linda Thomas, the aunt of Jessica and Sandra, 27 years old at the time, living with the family, and often helping with childcare whenever other adults were occupied. Linda was used to letting the two sisters play within sight in the front yard, a habit repeated many times without incident, so that morning brought no unusual feeling or warning. Linda's presence raised no suspicion. She was family, fully trusted, and that very familiarity made everything happen in such a normal state that no one thought it necessary to tighten supervision beyond the usual. One slightly unusual detail appeared, so subtle that it wasn't enough to interrupt the familiar routine. Linda briefly noticed a strange man walking past the area, near where the children were playing, an image that didn't quite fit the scene but wasn't clear enough to prompt immediate intervention. Her natural reaction at the time was to reassure herself that in an open neighborhood, strangers passing by was not uncommon. Small signals, like a silence that lasted longer than usual, a moment when Linda stepped inside the house to do a quick chore, or a delay when she called the children's names, were explained away by the harmless assumptions of small-town life. The kids were lost in play, ran to the next yard, or were hiding somewhere to mess around. The period of direct unsupervised time passed quietly. No one could pinpoint exactly how long it lasted, only that when Linda returned to the front yard, Jessica and Sandra were no longer where they were supposed to be. The first feeling that arose wasn't panic, but confusion, because in a community like Hutchinson, two children vanishing at the same time was almost unthinkable. The family began searching on instinct, calling the girls' names around the house, running to neighboring yards, asking neighbors they had just seen, and in those first minutes, hope still dominated as every answer was vague. No one was sure they had seen anything, and no one confirmed anything unusual. Panic only truly set in when the search circles closed without results, when the harmless assumptions ran out, and the void left by the two children became too large to ignore. Witnesses, including Linda, tried to recall every moment, but anxiety and guilt made the details fragmented, uncertain, and sometimes contradictory. As time passed with no sign that Jessica and Sandra had simply wandered off, the Thomas family was forced to face the possibility they had refused to admit from the start. The situation had slipped beyond their control, and that of the small community around them. The call to the police was made in a state of both hope and fear, marking the moment when the two children were no longer just playful kids who hadn't come home, but officially recorded as missing, opening a void that would last for years, beginning from that seemingly peaceful morning. The call from the Thomas family was received at the local police department, in a state where the full severity could not yet be determined, because at that time, reports of missing children were still familiar situations for small towns like Hutchinson, where most missing cases usually ended within a few hours with the children found in familiar areas. However, right from the first details provided, the fact that two children had vanished simultaneously, at ages too young to travel far on their own, and without any clear signs left behind, made it impossible for the duty officer to handle it as a routine case. Initial information was recorded hastily, but as completely as possible, including the names of the two victims, their ages, the last seen location, the estimated time of disappearance, and a list of people present in the period before the incident was discovered. The family's panicked state caused the details to come in a rush and without order, forcing the person taking the report to repeatedly ask for clarification to avoid missing critical facts. The missing persons file was created that very night, and the case was classified as missing children with higher than usual priority, due to the simultaneous disappearance of two victims and their particularly vulnerable ages, while also noting that this was not a case of an individual running away or going missing amid family conflict. The first officers dispatched to the scene were not only there to calm the family, but also to quickly determine whether there were any obvious signs of an accident. In the initial minutes of surveying the scene, the absence of any signs of chaos made the investigators realize this situation might be more complex than usual. The initial investigation scope was set based on the limited information available, focusing on the area where the two children were last seen, and the short routes they could have reached in the limited time, while simultaneously compiling a list of potential witnesses from neighbors and individuals present in the area that morning. The deployment of investigators was not ostentatious or large-scale from the start, following the standard procedure of a local police department, accustomed to handling minor cases. However, internal discussions had already begun cautiously about the possibility that this was no longer just a runaway case, because the usual indicators for such a conclusion were absent. Once the file reached minimal completion, the case was entered into the tracking system with specific timelines to prevent information from drifting or changing based on the emotions of those providing it, creating a basis for later cross-referencing if new statements emerged. The investigation scope was defined not only geographically, but also temporally, breaking the time before and after the disappearance into segments to assess the possibility of third-party intervention. This approach revealed a troubling reality: the window of time was short enough for a deliberate act to occur without being noticed. Investigators had to balance keeping the community calm with preparing for a more serious scenario, because in the social context of Hutchinson at the time, publicly launching a major investigation involving children could cause widespread panic, but delaying also meant risking the loss of the crucial first hours. The assessment of the case's severity gradually increased as the facts were systematically organized, showing that the disappearance did not fit any familiar pattern of random missing person cases previously handled. This difference forced the investigative unit to shift from a reactive state to one of heightened alertness, even without specific evidence to name what was happening. While the Thomas family remained on the fragile boundary between hope and fear, inside the police department's offices, the case was beginning to be viewed as a potentially prolonged and complex situation, where every decision in the early hours could directly affect the chances of finding the two girls. And from that moment, the normal life of Hutchinson was placed beside a new reality, where the sense of safety once taken for granted began to show its first cracks. Immediately after the case was elevated to high-priority status, investigators focused all their attention on the area where Jessica and Sandra were last seen, not with the expectation of finding a clear crime scene like in violent cases, but to determine whether that familiar space might conceal any overlooked signs of abnormality amid the initial chaos. The area was not far from the Thomas family home, an open space tied to the daily lives of neighborhood children, where the comings and goings of adults and kids occurred so naturally that it was hard to distinguish what behavior was noteworthy. That very familiarity became the first challenge of the survey process, because everything appeared exactly as it always had. Investigators conducted a thorough sweep of every potentially relevant point, from narrow walkways between houses, the yards where children usually played, to the edges of the road where visibility could be obstructed, trying to reconstruct the space as it was at the exact moment the children vanished, to assess whether an unusual event could have occurred in that short window, without attracting attention from those nearby. The terrain showed no obvious dangerous features, such as deep ponds, abandoned buildings, or areas that could cause accidents to young children, which gradually weakened the hypothesis of a random mishap. If the two girls had simply wandered off, it would have been difficult for them to leave the familiar area without leaving traces or being noticed by someone. Throughout the survey, no signs of violence were recorded, no drag marks, no disturbed items, no typical indicators of a struggle. The complete absence of these signs created a disturbing paradox. If there had been external intervention, it had been carried out so quickly and discreetly that it did not disrupt the outward order of the neighborhood. Investigators were forced to face the reality that this was not a traditional crime scene where physical evidence could be collected to reconstruct the event, but rather an information void where the absence of traces itself became the most important clue. The limited documentation of the scene was done with extreme care, because in 1982, forensic tools and scene preservation methods were not yet advanced enough to handle such subtle situations, and any mistake at this stage could cause the smallest leads to vanish forever. Investigators had to acknowledge that the disappearance area provided no clear anchor point, no specific boundaries to cordon off, no standout physical evidence to guide them, forcing them to rely more heavily on analyzing context and human behavior, rather than physical signs. When evaluating the overall space, one factor gradually became clear: the area allowed quick access from multiple directions, with uncontrolled entry and exit points, enough for a stranger to appear and leave in a short time without drawing attention, especially in the noisy, attention-dispersed daytime routine. This realization forced investigators to adjust their initial approach, because continuing to search for a violent crime scene was not only ineffective, but also risked missing more important aspects related to timing and opportunity, the two key factors in cases involving young children. Instead of focusing on what happened at a specific point, the investigation began shifting toward identifying who could have appeared in that time window, where they came from, and why their presence left no clear trace in the community's memory. This adjustment was not an admission of failure, but a necessary response to the reality that the disappearance area, though familiar and seemingly safe, provided no direct clues to explain the absence of the two children. In that context, every small detail about the space, from obstructed views at a corner of a yard to the close enough distance between houses for sounds to blend, was recorded not as evidence, but as factors helping explain why a serious event could occur without leaving obvious traces. The survey yielded no answers, but it established an important premise for the next phase of the investigation. If the physical scene said nothing, then the truth might lie in what people had seen, overlooked or forgotten in the brief moments before the two children vanished. And this realization forced investigators to leave the physical area behind and begin seeking answers in a less tangible but no less complex place. When the area yielded no physical traces strong enough to guide the investigation, attention naturally shifted to the human element, specifically those individuals who were present in or around the space at or around the time Jessica and Sandra disappeared. In the absence of a traditional crime scene, witness memories and statements became virtually the only source of data for reconstructing what had happened. A multi-layered witness list was compiled, starting with those directly present in the children's usual activity area, then expanding to nearby neighbors, people who passed through the neighborhood that morning, and even those only indirectly connected but potentially capable of seeing or hearing something unusual. The goal was to leave no perspective, however small, unexamined. The initial statement-taking process occurred amid high tension and emotional instability, as most witnesses were still reeling from shock and anxiety. This meant the information they provided was both reflexive and heavily influenced by emotion, forcing investigators to prioritize full documentation before evaluation to avoid inadvertently discarding details that might later prove critical in the right context. The first statements formed a fragmented picture, with timelines that did not fully align, actions described with varying degrees of certainty, and many witnesses using vague qualifiers such as maybe, seemed like, or not sure, accurately reflecting the psychological state of a small community suddenly confronted with something they had never imagined could happen. As the statements were cross-referenced, inconsistencies began to emerge, not in major points, but in seemingly minor details: the exact position of a person at a given moment, the direction a stranger was moving, or the sequence of events within a brief window. These discrepancies compelled investigators to consider that witness memory may have unconsciously adjusted to fit assumptions formed after the children's disappearance. Reliability of statements was not assessed by immediately discarding inconsistent information, but by correlating them with one another, weighing each witness's proximity to the incident area, their exposure time, and any possible motive, intentional or not, to distort information. Some statements were deemed of limited value due to heavy reliance on speculation rather than direct observation, while others, though brief and sparse, were scrutinized more closely because they came from individuals with advantageous vantage points or no direct psychological pressure from ties to the Thomas family. Alongside collection and analysis, investigators systematically eliminated obvious errors, such as reports of seeing the children at locations or times incompatible with the established timeline, to prevent the investigation from being derailed by unverifiable information. This process was not only about cleaning the data, but also about minimizing the spread of rumors, which tend to proliferate rapidly in small communities and are easily reinforced by collective fear. Once the witness list was finalized at a basic level, statements were reorganized chronologically, enabling investigators to identify points of convergence and information gaps, while making clear that no single statement was strong enough on its own to explain the children's disappearance. This led to a crucial realization: if a third party had intervened, the act must have occurred in a brief enough window and with sufficient stealth to leave no clear impression in any witness's memory, a fact that made sole reliance on statements highly risky. Nevertheless, statement collection remained pivotal at this stage, not as a source of direct answers, but as a tool to rule out implausible scenarios and narrow the range of what might have happened. When this phase temporarily concluded, investigators were left with an imperfect set of data that accurately reflected the nature of human memory in crisis situations. That very imperfection required greater caution in every conclusion and preparation for reconstructing the entire sequence based on the small, uncertain fragments provided by witnesses in the initial chaotic hours. From the imperfect but minimally filtered set of statements, investigators moved to a decisive phase for the entire direction of the case, reconstructing the final timeline of Jessica and Sandra's movements. With no physical traces at the scene and statements unable to provide a direct answer, only by placing every piece of information on a single timeline could they see the true structure of the disappearance. This work was not mechanical. It required stripping each statement of emotion, speculation, and panic-distorted memory, retaining only details that could be anchored to a time, even if only approximate, and arranging them in the most logical sequence. From the outset, differences in how witnesses recalled time became a major issue. The same moment was remembered by some as just now, and by others as a while ago, causing timelines to overlap or stretch unevenly. To address this, investigators had to rely on more fixed events, daily family routines, recurring neighborhood habits, and independently confirmed activities, to establish a relatively stable reference frame. Once these anchors were placed, key moments began to emerge more clearly. The last time the children were seen in normal circumstances, showing no signs of fear or abnormality, and the moment their absence was first recognized as inexplicable by routine assumptions. Between those 2 points lay a short but critical gap, a period during which no witness could confirm exactly what they saw, and no activity was definitively recorded. This gap, though limited in duration, became the focal point of the entire timeline, representing the sole window in which every possibility could have occurred without leaving clear traces. Investigators delineated this gap with extreme care, understanding that overexpanding it would dilute focus while arbitrarily narrowing it could exclude plausible scenarios. Once the gap was defined at its minimum necessary size, surrounding details were analyzed, pedestrian density in the area at that time, the community's level of distraction, and seemingly innocuous spatial factors that could affect visibility and observation. A growing consensus emerged that this familiar activity area, while appearing safe and open, allowed for the rapid appearance and disappearance of an outsider without prolonged attention, especially when everyone assumed no threat existed. From there, investigators began seriously evaluating the possibility of third-party intervention, not by hastily concluding motive or identity, but by asking whether a deliberate act could have occurred within the delineated time gap. To answer this, the timeline was tested against multiple scenarios: the children wandering off voluntarily, an environmental mishap, or being led away by someone else. In each case, the timeline served as the criterion for assessing plausibility. Scenarios without external intervention quickly revealed weaknesses, as they could not convincingly explain the simultaneous disappearance of 2 children without any trace or solid witness account. In contrast, the third-party scenario, though lacking direct evidence, aligned better with the timeline structure and the critical gap. This process did not aim for a definitive conclusion, but for progressively eliminating less plausible hypotheses while retaining those best supported by the available data. Investigators were fully aware that the timeline they were building was not a perfect replica of reality, but a temporary model reflecting what could have happened based on the uneven fragments of human memory. Yet this model revealed what could not be ignored: the disappearance was too clean to be explained by random carelessness, and too silent to fit an ordinary accident. When the final timeline was completed to the extent possible, it clearly exposed 2 parallel truths. Many initial hypotheses had been reasonably eliminated, preventing the investigation from spiraling into meaningless loops. Yet the remaining gaps were still large enough to conceal a deliberate act carried out quietly and with lasting consequences. Investigators ended this phase with a heavy but necessary realization: though the timeline did not provide a direct answer to Jessica and Sandra's fate, it drew clear boundaries around what could and could not have happened, forcing the investigation into a new state where every assumption had to be weighed against time, opportunity, and the possibility of external intervention, rather than relying on simple explanations that no longer held up against the reconstructed structure of events. Once the temporary timeline was established and key gaps identified, the investigation had to shift from analysis to action. In child disappearance cases, every passing hour reduces the likelihood of finding the victims safe, and that awareness made launching a large-scale search operation unavoidable. The Reno County Sheriff's Office quickly augmented its forces, while calls for assistance went out to neighboring agencies and the local community, where mutual familiarity was both an asset for manpower and a challenge for maintaining order and preventing information overload. Volunteers arrived in large numbers, driven by a desire to contribute in a situation no one had ever anticipated, and their spontaneous participation clearly reflected Hutchinson's culture, where the community is often seen as the first line of defense against any crisis. To channel enthusiasm into organized effort, investigators established a search grid, dividing the area into specific sectors based on the maximum distance the children could have traveled in the confirmed time frame. While accounting for terrain factors such as trails, open lots, neighborhood edges, and less noticed paths, this division ensured no area was overlooked and controlled information flow, as each search team was required to precisely record the location swept, the time, and any observations, preventing redundant coverage of one area while others were neglected. In parallel, all roads leading out of the neighborhood were scoured, from major routes to seldom-used side paths, because the timeline indicated that if external intervention had occurred, departure from the area could have been swift and leveraged the familiarity of the surroundings to avoid notice. The search expanded into adjacent neighborhoods, where every yard, shed, garage, and open space within legal limits was checked, with coordination between police and residents to maintain both legality and necessary speed. However, the farther the search extended, the harder it became to accept that no clear sign indicated Jessica and Sandra had passed through those places, and the absence of specific leads began to create a sense that the search was unfolding in a void. During the sweeps, several items were found and immediately drew attention. In the absence of a clear crime scene, any object potentially linked to the children was examined with care. These items were not dramatic or shocking, but their very ordinariness made evaluation difficult. They could simply be everyday objects forgotten in routine life, or they could be the only remnants of a silent chain of events. Investigators documented each item's location, time of discovery, and surrounding context, then attempted to determine whether it truly related to the time of disappearance, or was merely something that had existed beforehand, but gone unnoticed. Assessment of these items' investigative value was conducted cautiously, as in the early hours of the search the risk of over-attributing significance to irrelevant details was ever present, especially under pressure to find leads. Some items were quickly ruled out when cross-checked against statements and the established timeline, while others, though not providing direct answers, were retained as markers confirming that areas had been thoroughly searched and obvious possibilities eliminated. As the search continued, fatigue spread not only among official personnel, but throughout the community, with each hour without results, eroding the belief that the children were simply nearby. Investigators constantly adjusted strategy, balancing whether to further expand the grid or focus deeper on high-probability areas, while coordinating with the family to prevent unrealistic hope from rising and then crashing abruptly. The large-scale search, though tightly organized and mobilizing all available resources, gradually revealed its limits when no clear focal point emerged. The very absence of such a point meant that even the most sincere and persistent efforts could only advance so far. When critical areas had been swept multiple times, potential items evaluated without breakthrough, and the grid could no longer expand without redundancy, the search shifted from active hope to maintenance mode, where the goal was no longer immediate answers, but ensuring no obvious possibility was overlooked. The outcome of this phase was not the discovery of a decisive lead, but a collective realization: if Jessica and Sandra were not found within the search scope and conditions, the truth might lie beyond what even the best organized large-scale search could reach. That realization marked a significant psychological turning point in the entire process, as field efforts gradually gave way to harder questions about how and why two children could vanish without leaving traces in the very community considered the safest. When the large-scale search reached the practical limits of what was feasible and yielded no concrete results, the focus of the investigation was forced to shift from sweeping physical spaces to analyzing people and vehicles. With every reasonable area already checked and the two children still missing, the possibility that they had voluntarily left the neighborhood or encountered a random accident became increasingly untenable. Investigators began a systematic review of strangers who had appeared in the area shortly before and on the day of the incident, including individuals not residing in Hutchinson, those just passing through town briefly, or those with unclear schedules that morning, aiming to determine if any of them had been present during the critical time window identified from the timeline. In parallel, a list of suspicious vehicles was compiled based on witness statements, though most descriptions were vague, unfamiliar, never seen before, or moving slower than normal, reflecting the limits of human memory under stress, but still impossible to ignore. The vehicle review faced significant obstacles. In 1982, there were no surveillance cameras, no electronic data for quick tracing, and checking each vehicle relied almost entirely on the voluntary cooperation of owners and the recall of witnesses, making the process both time-consuming and prone to dead ends. From the scant data available, investigators turned to analyzing possible access to the two victims, asking who could have approached Jessica and Sandra without immediately raising suspicion, who was familiar enough not to attract attention yet distant enough to remain unnamed, and who could exploit the very safety of the neighborhood to approach the children in a short window without using force. This analysis highlighted a disturbing reality: the two children, being so young, could have been led away simply by words or gestures, especially if the person approaching did not evoke fear, and it was precisely this possibility that made the deliberate abduction hypothesis increasingly serious within the investigation. Proposing this hypothesis did not mean a specific suspect had been identified, but rather an acknowledgement that other scenarios were increasingly inconsistent with the established timeline and search results. The simultaneous disappearance of two children in a familiar area, leaving no physical traces, was highly unlikely without intentional external intervention. However, as soon as the abduction hypothesis was formally considered, the investigation faced a new challenge: a complete absence of direct clues to identify who might have carried it out. Investigators received a flood of external tips and reports, from calls claiming sightings of the children in other towns to reports of suspicious individuals unrelated to Hutchinson, and each piece of information had to be carefully checked to avoid missing a slim chance. The process of vetting these leads consumed substantial resources, as every tip, no matter how vague, carried hope of a breakthrough, but when cross-checked against the timeline and established facts, most quickly proved inconsistent, either mismatched in time, location, or simply based on confusion and unfounded speculation. Eliminating false leads was not just a technical step, but a psychologically draining process for both investigators and families, as each ruled out possibility closed another door of hope. Gradually, the list of strangers and suspicious vehicles narrowed, yet no name stood out enough to become the focus of the investigation, while initial hypotheses continued to be tested without new support. The investigation began to exhaust itself, not from lack of effort, but from a lack of new strong information to shift the course. The repetitive cycle of sweeps, checks and eliminations made the sense of impasse increasingly palpable. Investigators realized they were facing a situation where every reasonable avenue had been explored within the limits of the tools and data available at the time, yet no direction led to a specific answer about Jessica and Sandra's fate. In that context, the abduction hypothesis, though the most consistent with the structure of the events, remained only a logical conclusion that could not yet be proven, a hypothesis unable to drive the investigation further without concrete evidence linking it to a specific person or action. This deadlock did not arrive suddenly, but formed gradually through each discarded lead, each unconfirmed suspicion, and each passing day without progress, leaving the entire investigation in a state of limbo, where every question had been asked but no answer was solid enough to close the case. When this phase ended, the investigation did not stop due to lack of resolve, but because it had reached the limits of what was possible under the circumstances, leaving behind a troubling but unproven hypothesis and a collection of facts too weak to break the silence surrounding the case. The prolonged stalemate after every reasonable hypothesis had been examined, and every potential lead systematically eliminated, forced the investigating agency to face a difficult but unavoidable decision. The official search for Jessica and Sandra could not continue at the same intensity as in the early days, as resources were finite, and no new facts justified maintaining a large-scale operation. This decision was not made in a single decisive moment, but developed gradually through internal meetings, where each unit reported what had been done, what had been tried, and what had yielded no results, showing that every viable approach under the conditions of the time had reached its limit. Ending the official search did not mean abandoning the case, but it marked the end of the emergency action phase, where the hope of finding the children quickly gave way to a colder reality that the matter might remain unresolved indefinitely. The frequency of investigative activity decreased markedly, not from lack of care, but because there was no new information to process at a high pace, forcing investigators to shift to a reactive mode, waiting for any future tips or leads that might emerge. Periodic reviews continued, but the intervals between them grew longer, and each return to the file brought the familiar feeling of rereading old facts without finding a new angle. Meanwhile, external tips dwindled, local media attention faded without new developments to report, and the disappearance that once shook Hutchinson gradually receded from collective consciousness, replaced by other everyday concerns. The case file was completed to the maximum extent possible at the time, including scene reports, witness statements, search results, lists of checked leads, and hypotheses considered, then archived according to procedure, an administrative act that carried heavy psychological weight for those directly involved. Archiving did not make the case disappear, but it placed it in a different state, where all information was frozen in time, awaiting an external factor strong enough to break the long silence. For the investigators, seeing the file of Jessica and Sandra placed among unsolved cases was an acknowledgement of the limits of the era's capabilities and tools, a reminder that not every question can be answered immediately, no matter how much effort was expended. The case, once an all-consuming emergency that dominated the time and attention of law enforcement, gradually became just one name on a long list of cases awaiting a breakthrough, each file carrying its own story, but sharing the same characteristic, the absence of the decisive piece. As years passed, personnel changes within the agency led those who had been directly involved to transfer, retire, or take on other duties, and knowledge of the case no longer existed as vivid memory, but was passed on through paper and reports, gradually diminishing personal connection to details once deemed critical. In that context, the case of Jessica and Sandra was no longer a top priority, but a file referenced when time, reason, or new information warranted pulling it from dormancy. With no clear path forward, investigators were forced to accept that at the time, no next step was both reasonable and feasible, and continuing to investigate without data risked merely repeating past efforts with no different outcome. For the Thomas family, This transition was especially painful, as it was not only the end of a public search phase, but the moment they realized that from then on, the story of their two children would no longer be mentioned daily in investigation meetings or on the streets where missing posters once hung. The silence that gradually enveloped the case did not come from a single decision, but from the accumulation of days without news, weeks without calls, and months without progress, causing the case to slip quietly into the shadows of collective memory. Yet even archived, the file of Jessica and Sandra remained an open entity, a set of unanswered questions, and it was precisely this state of suspension that defined it as a true cold case, not because no one cared, but because every feasible investigative avenue at the time had led to the same result: silence. The transition to cold case status did not bring closure, only a prolonged pause, where time became the only element continuing to flow, carrying the faint hope that one day what investigators could not achieve in the early years might become possible when context, tools, and circumstances changed. When the file of Jessica and Sandra was placed in dormant storage in the agency's archives, the story of the two children's disappearance seemed to end in Hutchinson. But in reality, their lives did not end in the void left by the investigation. They continued elsewhere, in a context completely detached from the memory of the Thomas family and the town where they were born. The two children were taken to an unfamiliar location, carrying no signs linking them to their previous life, and in that new environment, their presence was not seen as that of missing victims, but as children in need of care and integration. The change of living space occurred when they were too young to comprehend or question it, especially Sandra, who had almost no ability to retain clear memories of her early years, while Jessica, though older, retained only fragmented sensations, insufficient to form a complete story of once belonging to another family. A new identity was established as part of arranging their new life, complete with names, documents, and personal information that did not reflect their true origins, but were sufficient for them to exist legally in the new environment, without suspicion or hindrance. In this world, Jessica and Sandra were no longer names on missing posters or local news reports. They became different individuals with a history constructed from the moment they began their new life. The new environment brought different habits, rules, and relationships, requiring the two children to adapt without any comparison to the past, as that past had been severed completely from the start. Separation from their biological family did not occur as a conscious event they could grasp, but as an obvious fact of life, because in their perception at the time, the family around them was the entire world they knew. There were no questions about where they came from, because such questions were never asked, and there were no signs in daily life that forced them to suspect their current identity was not their true one. Changing environments meant changing the entire frame of reference for safety, familiarity, and memory, causing all traces of their previous life to fade, not because they were deliberately erased, but because they were no longer reinforced through daily experience. Jessica, being older, may have carried vague, unnamed feelings, moments of unexplained confusion when encountering familiar things she could not clearly recall, but those feelings were quickly overwhelmed by the need to integrate and adapt to the new environment. Sandra, meanwhile, grew up almost entirely in this new world, where all memories formed were tied to her new identity, making the existence of a biological family an idea with no place in her consciousness. The new life did not necessarily carry negative or unstable colors. For the two children, it was simply the only life they knew, with relationships, experiences, and developmental milestones unfolding as normally as for any other child. Yet this normalcy was built on an incomplete foundation, where a part of the past had been entirely severed, creating an invisible void they themselves were unaware of. Living in a different location, in a different community, meant there were no natural connections between the two children and the place of their birth, making it nearly impossible for them to be recognized or reconnected with their old life in the limited information context of those years. The new identity was not just a name, but an entire system of documents, social relationships, and personal history built around them, creating a wall between them and the disappearance story that once shocked Hutchinson. As time passed, the change of environment gradually became stable, with new habits reinforced and faint memories of early years no longer recalled or confirmed, allowing them to blend seamlessly into the new life, as if no rupture had ever occurred. Being separated from their biological family did not mean a lack of affection or care in the new environment, but it created the reality that blood ties had been severed without choice or consent from those directly involved. To the outside world, Jessica and Sandra were simply two children, growing up somewhere, carrying no signs that they had once been the center of a long and painful investigation, and it was precisely this invisibility that allowed their story to continue parallel to the cold case file, without ever intersecting. As the two children grew up in the new environment, all identifying signs from the past became even fainter, not only because of natural changes in appearance over time, but also because of the complete absence of reference points for comparison, making any link to the search images from years earlier virtually impossible. The different life that Jessica and Sandra entered was not a conscious escape, but the result of a chain of events that pushed them out of their original trajectory and placed them on an entirely different path, where each step took them farther from their starting point without leaving clear traces. While in Hutchinson, the case of the two children quietly faded into oblivion, elsewhere, their lives continued on their own rhythm, with joys, hardships, and experiences shaped by the new environment, carrying no memory of the peaceful morning in 1982 that set in motion a chain of events they would never know about. As Jessica and Sandra's new life entered a more stable phase, their childhood gradually took shape within the framework of their substitute family, where every habit, relationship, and memory was rebuilt from scratch, with no direct continuity to their previous existence. Their growing up unfolded step by step, following the familiar rhythms of family and community life, steady enough to obscure the fact that the foundation of that identity had been constructed upon a rupture they themselves were unaware of. The substitute family became the center of their childhood world, where daily routines, expressions of affection, and the roles of each member were clearly established, creating a necessary sense of order for the development of young children, especially in the context of them not carrying full memories of their earliest years. Jessica, at an age already capable of some level of recollection and comparison, went through the initial adaptation period with a range of hard-to-name emotions, as fragmented memories were not clear enough to form a coherent story, yet present enough to make her feel that something did not quite align with the life she was living. These feelings did not manifest as outright resistance or direct questions, but rather as hesitation, moments of withdrawal, or fleeting sensations of being out of place in seemingly ordinary situations. In contrast, Sandra, too young to retain memories of her birth family, formed virtually all of her understanding of the world within the new environment, where every relationship was taken as natural and in no need of explanation, making her new identity self-evident from the earliest stages of development. The age difference meant the two sisters experienced childhood under the same roof, but with different layers of experience, one carrying a vague sense of something missing, the other having almost no reference point to recognize the rupture that had once occurred. The new family relationship was built on care and responsibility, sufficient to meet material and daily needs, but not always capable of creating deep emotional bonds, since these connections were not formed from shared memories or long-term experiences, but from assigned roles maintained over time. In that environment, Jessica and Sandra learned to adapt to the expectations of the adults around them, from behavior and forms of address to compliance with family rules, and this very process helped reinforce the new identity as part of their developing sense of self. The restriction of access to original information became a constant feature of the two children's childhood, not necessarily through deliberate concealment, but through the complete absence of stories, images, or details that could hint at the past before they entered their new life. Personal documents, when used on necessary occasions, only reflected the information that had been established, providing no clues leading back to their true origins. For the two children, those administrative details held no meaning beyond confirming their legal existence in society. In the school environment, Jessica and Sandra blended in like any other children, carrying their new names, a consistently recounted family history, and childhood stories that left no room for doubt, as no element was striking enough to prompt teachers or peers to question their authenticity. Yet the sisters' childhood experiences were not entirely complete in the usual sense. Though outwardly stable and normal, there remained hard-to-articulate gaps, especially for Jessica, who at times felt she did not fully belong, even if she could not clearly identify the reason. These gaps did not lead to clear crises or conflicts, as they were quickly covered over by the daily routine, academic demands, social relationships, and the desire to be accepted, pushing any latent questions to the back of consciousness. The bond between the two sisters became an important anchor in that context. Though their identities and surroundings had changed, the presence of the other still offered a rare sense of familiarity, an invisible thread connecting two individuals growing up in a world that did not fully reflect their origins. This attachment was not necessarily expressed in words, but shown through the way they sought each other in moments of unease or shared experiences without needing much explanation. As time passed, the years of childhood accumulated into a stable chain of memories, sufficient to fill the void left by the initial rupture, yet not enough to completely erase the latent sense of lack. For Sandra, childhood unfolded almost entirely within this framework, tying all experiences to the substitute family and surrounding community, while for Jessica, each passing year simultaneously strengthened the new identity and blurred the old memories, creating a state of being caught between remembering and forgetting. Thus, childhood under a new identity was not a series of dramatic or overtly unstable days, but a prolonged process of adaptation in which outward normalcy concealed an incomplete foundation of personal history. These experiences shaped the way the two children viewed themselves and the world, laying the groundwork for future relationships and the way they would confront questions of identity later on, even though at that point everything proceeded in silence, with no specific event strong enough to force them to pause and ask who they were and where they once belonged. As Jessica and Sandra moved beyond their early years under new identities, and gradually entered a stage where personal records began to play a more significant role in social life, small but structural irregularities started to emerge, not clear enough to cause a crisis, yet persistent enough to create a foundation of data that was not entirely consistent. The sisters' personal records were created to meet basic administrative requirements, from identification documents and medical files to information for education, but because they were established without any link to the original data, they carried gaps and discrepancies that at the time, no one had the motivation or tools to thoroughly cross-check. The children's dates of birth, one of the core pieces of any record, were not always recorded uniformly across all documents, as determining the exact timeline based on incomplete sources produced small differences between files. Differences that could coexist undetected within an administrative system that operated on trust in the data provided. These inconsistencies were not major errors easily spotted, but rather manifested as slight variations in dates, middle names, or mismatches between forms created at different times, making them easily dismissed as routine clerical mistakes, rather than signs of a deeper issue. In the context of those years, when personal data mainly existed in paper form and was stored in a dispersed manner across various agencies, the absence of centralized cross-referencing became a key factor that allowed these irregularities to go unnoticed, as there was no automatic mechanism to compare, match, or flag inconsistencies between local systems. Each agency only saw the data directly relevant to its own functions, and when that information was sufficient to complete the task at hand, there was no reason to question the integrity of the entire record. For Jessica and Sandra, these irregularities existed as part of their administrative life that they had to accept, not because they understood or suspected anything, but because they had no basis to believe their own data could be inaccurate. When documents were used in specific situations, such as school enrollment, medical checkups, or routine social procedures, these minor conflicts rarely caused actual obstacles, as they were usually resolved with flexible adjustments or overlooked as insignificant technical errors. This very flexibility in the system, intended to facilitate citizens, inadvertently covered up signs of irregularity that might have led to earlier questions about the children's true origins. In the family and community environment, where Jessica and Sandra grew up, personal documents were not a topic of discussion or close scrutiny, as daily life did not require constant confrontation with that data, and when it was mentioned, it merely served to confirm a reality long accepted. This meant that the irregularities, though present, were not linked to any suspicion about identity, but rather viewed as part of an imperfect administrative process where minor errors were normal. The date of birth, seemingly a simple detail, became the clearest example of this inconsistency. On some documents it was recorded one way, while on others, there was a slight difference, enough to cause confusion if placed side by side, but not enough to create conflict in individual contexts. Similar contradictions appeared in other information, such as place of birth, full names, or details about early years, reflecting the reality that the children's records were not built on a unified data source, but rather compiled from information provided at different times, by different individuals, with varying degrees of accuracy. The lack of centralized cross-checking meant no central authority could see the full picture, allowing each piece of data to exist independently, without being challenged by the rest. In that context, these overlooked irregularities were not the result of deliberate blindness, but of a fragmented system not designed to detect such issues, especially when they did not cause immediate or urgent consequences. For Jessica and Sandra, these inconsistent data did not create clear feelings of unease at this stage, as they were never placed in a situation requiring them to compare their records against another source to notice the discrepancies. Those documents simply existed, were used when needed, and stored when not, becoming part of the foundation of life without being questioned. However, the quiet existence of these irregularities created a layer of data sediment, where small deviations accumulated over time, without resolution, causing the sisters' personal records to drift further from any verifiable original source. As the years passed, the administrative system continued to operate in its familiar way, and each time a new document was created based on old data, the inconsistencies were either copied or arbitrarily adjusted, further reinforcing the state of inconsistency without anyone noticing. This neglect was not personal, but the result of a fragmented system in which responsibility was divided, and there was no convergence point to detect irregularities beyond the scope of each department's duties. In that context, Jessica and Sandra's personal records existed as formally valid structures, but historically incomplete, sufficient to allow them to live, study, and grow in society, yet insufficient to reflect the truth about who they were. These data irregularities, therefore, were not loud or shocking signs, but silent discrepancies, buried beneath the normalcy of everyday life, waiting for a different time and context when they could be re-examined, under the light of tools and questions that at this stage did not yet exist. From the foundation of inconsistent but still functional personal records in daily life, Jessica and Sandra entered adulthood without any clear moment of transition that forced them to look back or doubt the identity they carried. as everything around them operated smoothly, based on information long accepted. As adolescence drew to a close, the sisters began building their own paths in society, with increasingly personal choices, from education and career directions to social relationships, extending beyond the substitute family, and throughout that process, their new identity continued to be used as an unquestioned reality, unchallenged by any sufficiently strong factor. Entering the workforce happened along different paths, but all relied on the same long-established system of documents and information, sufficient to meet hiring requirements, sign contracts, and participate in official social structures, without significant obstacles. Professional records were built on existing data, continuing to reproduce the established personal information, and each career milestone inadvertently reinforced the legitimacy of that identity, making it increasingly difficult to question. In the workplace, Jessica and Sandra were seen as independent individuals with their own abilities, personalities, and histories, and no element in professional interactions required others to suspect their origins, as all necessary identity verification was present and legal. Alongside work, emotional and family life gradually took shape, bringing new roles as spouse, parent, or relative within another family structure, where personal identity was not only an administrative matter, but also the foundation for close relationships. When building their own families, stories about the past were usually told simply and consistently with what had long been known and believed, leaving no room for unverified details or questions beyond the familiar framework. The identity remained stable, not only because of the paper trail, but also because of an expanding social network, where each new acquaintance, colleague, or family member accepted and reflected back the same image of who they were, creating a reinforcing loop that made doubt unnecessary. In this context, the past was not a haunting void, but a story already told and accepted, incomplete yet sufficient to support the present, without demanding deeper excavation. The irregularities once present in personal records faded into the background during adulthood, obscured by repeated copying and use, becoming part of the standard data no one had reason to cross-check. In everyday life, Jessica and Sandra rarely faced procedures requiring in-depth origin verification, and even when providing documents for more important purposes, the system accepted what had long been established without further inquiry. Adult life, with its own pressures of work, family, and social responsibilities, fully occupied their attention, so thoughts about the past, if they arose, appeared only as fleeting moments, never strong enough to become a drive to seek the truth. For Jessica, the feelings of mismatch that surfaced in childhood sometimes returned as vague questions, but they were quickly pushed aside by the busy pace of life and new family roles, where stability and duty came first. Sandra, meanwhile, entered adulthood with a perception almost entirely tied to her new identity, making the earlier past non-existent as a topic for reflection or questioning. Maintaining a stable identity was not a conscious effort, but the natural outcome of living within a system that had accepted and reproduced that identity through every interaction, every relationship, and every life milestone. Their own families, work, and social networks formed a solid enough structure to cover any remaining gaps from the past, making questions about origins unnecessary, even somewhat superfluous, in a life that demanded focus on the present and future. The unquestioned past was not completely erased, but frozen in a simplified version that did not conflict with what was happening, sufficient to be accepted without causing internal or social conflict. As the years continued to pass, each new adult milestone added another layer of confirmation to the existing identity, making the possibility of looking back and doubting increasingly remote, not due to a lack of curiosity, but due to the absence of any clear signal that questioning was necessary. Adult life under a false identity thus flowed as a steady current, where individuals were built from present choices and existing relationships, while the past, though incomplete, remained quietly behind, undisturbed, unexamined, and not seen as something that needed clarification in order to move forward. As Jessica and Sandra's adult lives continued to run smoothly under identities long accepted in a completely separate space, subtle shifts in investigative approaches began to take place, not stemming from their personal story, but from the systemic needs of law enforcement agencies facing a backlog of unresolved cases spanning many years. In that context, the review of old child disappearance cases became part of a broader effort to reassess dormant files that had been frozen by the technological and data limitations of past decades, with the goal of determining whether cases once considered dead ends could be re-examined from a different perspective. This review process was not personalized at the outset, but was conducted systematically, based on criteria such as the victims' ages, the circumstances of the disappearance, the degree of absence of physical evidence, and the potential for data to be cross-referenced in the present context. Among the long list of such cases, the 1982 file concerning two missing sisters in Hutchinson gradually emerged from its dormant state, not because of any specific new lead, but because the structure of the case matched many of the criteria that made it suitable for re-examination. When opened, this file clearly reflected the limitations of the original investigation: a trace-free crime scene, vague witness statements, a timeline with critical gaps, and an unproven abduction hypothesis, all forming an incomplete picture that had never been fully ruled out. The selection of the 1982 file did not mean it immediately became the focal point. Rather, it was the first step in a comparative process, cross-referencing it with new data accumulated over the years, including other missing persons reports, adoption records, and previously fragmented administrative data. Investigators began examining the case in relation to similar incidents, looking for commonalities in age, circumstances of disappearance, and the method of vanishing without trace, to determine whether this file might fit into a broader pattern. When placed alongside new data, the 1982 file began to reveal notable characteristics, not in what it contained, but in what it lacked, particularly the absence of any linkage between the missing victims' identities and any personal records established afterward. This comparison was not a one-time event, but a repetitive process, where each small detail was placed next to various data sources to test for matches, even indirect ones. During this process, investigators recognized that the 1982 file showed significant similarities to certain other cases that had been resolved late, where victims were not killed, but placed into a different life with new identities. And this very similarity began to make the possibility of connection more seriously considered. Recognizing the potential connection did not mean drawing conclusions. It was an acknowledgement that this case, though old and lacking leads, could still interact with modern data sources in ways that had previously been impossible. Investigators started re-examining information once deemed insufficiently valuable, placing it in a new context where inconsistencies in the personal records of individuals of unknown origin could carry different meaning than at the time. When revisited, the 1982 file was no longer merely the story of two children vanishing on a peaceful morning. It became a set of data capable of connecting to larger information systems, where small pieces could be fitted together to form a new picture. This process did not happen quickly or easily, as each comparison required extreme caution to avoid erroneous linkages, especially since old data contained many gaps and potential inaccuracies. Yet it was precisely the existence of those gaps that made the 1982 file stand out in the review process, as they suggested the possibility that the story had never been fully told, rather than having been resolved and forgotten. As new data, from administrative systems to reports on children of unknown origin, was brought into comparison, the old file began to be placed into an information network it had never inhabited before, opening up connections that investigators of the 1980s could not have imagined. At this stage, Recognizing the potential connection remained theoretical, but it was enough to change the way the case was viewed, from a closed matter in terms of action to a file that needed to be re-examined with the patience and tools of the modern era. While Jessica and Sandra continued their lives completely unaware that their past was being pulled back onto investigators' desks, the 1982 file was gradually repositioned as an incomplete case, an unanswered question. And this repositioning marked the first significant shift in bringing the case out of its dormant state, not by a sudden new lead, but by a change in the way people viewed and connected data that had existed for a very long time. From the moment the 1982 file was pulled from dormancy and viewed as a case with remaining potential rather than one that had reached its limit, the need for a more systematic and in-depth approach became clear, leading to the establishment of a dedicated cold case unit in Kansas tasked with reviewing dormant cases using methods and tools suited to the modern context. This unit did not operate on the urgent pace of active cases, but followed a different logic, where time was no longer a direct pressure, but accuracy and patience were prioritized, allowing investigators to revisit every old detail without being swept up by the rush of other priorities. One of the first and most important steps of the cold case unit was to digitize the entire file related to the case, including crime scene reports, witness statements, investigative notes, search maps, and every supporting document collected in the early years, transforming a scattered paper file into a flexible, accessible, comparable, and analyzable data system. Digitization was not merely for storage, but to remove the physical limitations that had once made cross-referencing information difficult. Once data was converted to digital form, investigators could quickly spot contradictions, repetitions, or gaps that had previously been obscured by the sheer volume of paperwork. Reanalysis of the file occurred alongside digitization as cold case unit investigators approached the case without the assumptions or pressures that had existed during the original investigation, allowing them to reread old documents with fresh eyes, paying attention to details once considered unimportant or unworthy of pursuit. When witness statements were placed side by side in a unified data system, patterns and gaps became clearer, not to create a new crime scene, but to identify points where the previous investigation could not proceed further due to lack of appropriate tools. Cross-referencing federal data became a major turning point in the modern approach, because unlike the 1980s, when information was fragmented between local and federal agencies, current systems allowed connections and comparisons across multiple sources, including missing persons files, adoption records, personal registrations, and other administrative databases. For the 1982 file, this cross-referencing was not about finding a specific lead already pointed out, but about seeing whether old facts could indirectly match any information recorded in the decades since. This process required great caution, as each potential match had to be evaluated within the full context of the data to avoid hasty linkages between information that only superficially resembled each other. When federal systems were brought in, the scope of the case expanded beyond Kansas, allowing investigators access to data they could not have reached before, and this expansion completely changed the perception of the case's solvability. Reopening the investigation did not mean repeating what had already been done, but asking new questions based on old data, such as whether the two victims might have been recorded in other systems under different identities, or whether anomalies in the personal records of individuals of unknown origin could relate to the 1982 disappearance. Cold case unit investigators did not seek a single breakthrough moment, but built step by step, testing hypotheses through data comparison, rather than relying on intuition or speculation, reflecting a fundamental shift in investigative methodology compared to the time of the case. Reanalysis also clarified the limitations of the original investigation, not to criticize or second-guess past decisions, but to understand the context and conditions that led to dead ends, thereby avoiding repeating them now. When data was placed side by side in a modern system, the 1982 file no longer existed as a standalone story, but became part of a larger information network, where every small detail could take on new meaning when connected correctly. This process did not happen quickly and did not yield immediate results, but it created a solid investigative foundation where every hypothesis had to pass through data filters and cross-disciplinary comparison before being taken seriously. For the cold case unit, reopening the investigation was not only an effort to find answers to a specific case, but also proof of how modern technology and methods could change the fate of files once considered unsolvable. In that context, the 1982 file was placed into a new process where patience, data, and federal connectivity created conditions that previous investigators did not have, opening an entirely different investigative space from the initial phase, even while still relying on the same facts that had existed for a very long time. From the foundation of digitized and restructured data created by the cold case unit, the investigation entered a completely different phase in nature when genealogical DNA was introduced as a central tool, not to confirm a specific suspect, but to answer the fundamental question that had hung unresolved for decades: where did the two children who disappeared in 1982 go, and do they still exist in the social system under some form? DNA collection did not occur in the direct manner typical of criminal cases, as no biological samples were preserved from the scene, nor was there a clear subject for comparison. Investigators were thus forced to approach indirectly, relying on the ability to trace kinship through voluntary DNA databases that had formed and grown rapidly in recent years. These data, originally collected for personal purposes such as genealogy or health research, opened an entirely new space for investigation, where family connections could be identified even when direct identities had been changed or obscured by time. The genealogical DNA analysis began by identifying suitable data points for matching, not to seek absolute matches, but to detect more distant kinship relationships sufficient to indicate that an individual of unknown origin might have a biological link to a family that once reported a missing child. Experts in data analysis involved in this process did not merely handle raw genetic sequences, they also had to place them in a genealogical context, building hypothetical relationship trees based on degrees of DNA similarity, thereby tracing potential intersection points between different family branches. When initial matches appeared, they were not treated as evidence, but as statistical indicators suggesting the possible existence of an unrecorded blood relationship. Investigators approached these results with extreme caution, because genealogical DNA, though powerful, still depends on the completeness of the data, and can produce false positives, if not rigorously verified by supplementary methods. Nevertheless, the emergence of recurring connections, when multiple different results pointed in a similar direction, began to form a noteworthy pattern, where seemingly unrelated individuals showed genetic similarity levels high enough to raise questions about their true origins. Kinship matching was conducted in parallel with cross-referencing previously digitized administrative data, allowing investigators to examine whether individuals with potential DNA links had personal records containing anomalies, similar to those noted in the 1982 case. As these layers of data were overlaid, certain cases began to stand out, not because of perfect matches, but because of the convergence of multiple indirect factors: kinship relationships at an appropriate level, personal records lacking clear origins, and the timing of identity formation, aligning with the period after the disappearance. A match in this context was not a single dramatic moment, but the result of an accumulating data process, where individual results might not be convincing on their own, but when placed together formed an increasingly hard-to-ignore logical chain. Investigators did not rush to announce or act on early matches. Instead, they focused on narrowing the verification scope, eliminating unsuitable possibilities, and retaining those with the highest relevance for deeper examination. This narrowing process required close coordination between DNA experts, investigators, and data-holding agencies, as each verification step could shift the entire direction of the investigation. Cases that did not meet sufficient criteria were systematically excluded, not because they were entirely unrelated, but because they did not fit the overall data structure that had been built. As the verification scope gradually narrowed, investigators began to see a clearer picture of the possibility that the two victims who disappeared in 1982 did not vanish from the world, but continued to exist in society under different identities, protected by the fragmentation of data systems and the technological limitations of the earlier era. The genealogical DNA breakthrough, therefore, was not merely technical, it represented a fundamental change in the approach to the question of Jessica and Sandra's fate, shifting the focus from searching for traces of a crime to tracing biological connections that had been severed and covered by time. In this phase, all results were considered open-ended, with no hasty conclusions, because investigators understood that genealogical DNA was a tool to guide the way, not to close the case, and that every potential match needed to be placed in a longer chain of verification before it could be considered a true advance. However, even without reaching a final conclusion, the existence of recurring matches and increasingly tight data logic had created a pivotal turning point, where for the first time in decades, the investigation was no longer looking only to the past to explain a disappearance, but beginning to look to the present to find specific individuals who might carry the answers the 1982 file had waited far too long to receive. From the directional but not yet conclusive DNA matches in the genealogy, the investigation moved into the phase of tracing back identities, with much stricter requirements. At this point, the question was no longer about the mere possibility of a biological connection, but about identifying exactly which individuals in the present world could correspond to the two missing persons from 1982. The starting point for this phase was linking the genealogy DNA results to adoption records and child welfare arrangements from the same time period. A complex task because the adoption system in the 1980s operated in a decentralized manner under multiple levels of authority and was not always archived in a way that allowed easy reverse tracing. Investigators had to access individual files one by one, cross-referencing the timing, location and circumstances under which new identities were established for individuals within the DNA match range, to determine if any case aligned with the structure of the missing persons case. This was not a broad search, but a selective one based on pre-established criteria such as matching age, the point of entry into the administrative system, and any unusual indicators recorded in personal files. As adoption records were brought under scrutiny, a major challenge emerged. Many files lacked original information or contained only minimal detail, accurately reflecting a time when data standardization was not prioritized. This forced investigators to rely on indirect clues such as the child's initial placement location, the chain of responsibility transfers, or the involvement of intermediary organizations. In parallel with reviewing adoption records, federal data was cross-referenced at a deeper level, leveraging the ability to connect previously entirely separate systems, from personal identification databases and administrative records, to sources related to movement and changes of residence. This cross-referencing was not aimed at finding a single match, but at testing the consistency of each potential case across multiple layers of data, in order to eliminate individuals whose DNA matched, but whose administrative history did not align with the timeline of the case. As the data layers were overlaid, the scope of verification began to narrow sharply, from a large number of potential cases down to only a few individuals with sufficient elements to warrant further examination. The narrowing down to the two victims did not happen in a single dramatic moment of revelation. It was the result of a prolonged process of elimination, where each incompatible case was crossed out based on inconsistencies between DNA, adoption records, and federal data. At a certain point, the data structure began to converge in a way that could not be ignored. Two adults living under stable identities, fully meeting the criteria for age, timeline, and degree of DNA similarity, emerged as the strongest candidates for deeper verification. Even at this stage, however, investigators maintained maximum caution because mistakenly assigning an identity could cause serious harm to the individuals involved and potentially collapse the entire investigation if found to lack foundation. Therefore, every subsequent step was carefully prepared from a legal standpoint to ensure that access and verification did not exceed the permissible limits of privacy rights and due process. Legal confirmation preparation became an indispensable part of the identity tracing phase, as investigators worked closely with legal advisors to determine the proper methods for gathering additional information, collecting reference DNA samples, and accessing sensitive files lawfully. These procedures were not rushed, because any mistake could cause the verification results to be rejected or deemed inadmissible, especially in a case that had already spanned decades and was subject to intense scrutiny. During this preparation, investigators re-reviewed the entire chain of data that had led them to this point, ensuring that no untested assumptions or overlooked facts remained, because once the official confirmation phase began, there would be no room for experimental adjustments. At this stage, tracing back identities was no longer a purely data-driven exercise. It became an interdisciplinary process where science, administration, and law had to operate in sync to ensure that any final conclusion, if reached, would withstand all scrutiny. For the investigators, narrowing down to 2 potential victims did not bring a sense of closure. It only marked the transition to an even more sensitive phase, where every decision could directly affect the lives of individuals who had lived for many years under different identities. Therefore, the identity tracing phase was conducted at a deliberate but steady pace, reflecting the understanding that the truth, though now very close, still needed to be approached with absolute respect and precision. Only when every element was verified and placed correctly could the true identities of the 2 victims be legally and indisputably established. When the scope of verification had been narrowed to just 2 individuals who best fit the entire data structure built throughout the identity tracing process, the investigation entered its most sensitive and decisive phase, transforming all hypotheses, inferences, and indirect matches into indisputable legal confirmation. Supplementary DNA testing was implemented as the first step in this process, no longer limited to genealogy or statistical levels, but aimed at establishing direct biological relationships between the 2 adults and the biological families who had reported their children missing in 1982. The samples were collected and processed under strict protocols to ensure the chain of custody and analysis met current forensic standards, because any error at this stage could undermine the legal value of the entire result. The results were not considered in isolation, but placed alongside the previously obtained genealogy DNA data to check for consistency, confirming that the detected biological relationships were not random coincidences, but reflected direct kinship. In parallel with the DNA testing, the process of cross-referencing original documents was conducted with the highest level of care, as this step aimed to connect the scientific findings to the administrative history that had existed for decades. Investigators and legal advisors jointly reviewed all records related to the 1982 disappearance, from original birth certificates and missing persons reports to documents recording the search process and archived files, to identify details that could be directly compared with the personal records established afterward. This comparison did not focus solely on obvious information such as names or dates of birth, but also examined less apparent factors such as initial recording locations, chains of responsibility transfers, and gaps in administrative records that could explain the formation of new identities. When the original documents were placed beside the current personal records, the inconsistencies that had previously existed were no longer viewed as isolated administrative errors, but became logical indicators reflecting a process of identity change that occurred in the absence of interagency cross-checking mechanisms of the earlier era. The true identity confirmation process did not occur in a single moment, but was the result of synthesizing and cross-verifying multiple independent sources. DNA provided biological evidence, original documents provided historical context, and modern administrative data served as a bridge between the 2 periods. When these elements converged without internal contradictions, investigators reached a sufficiently high level of certainty to affirm that the two adults under verification were indeed Jessica and Sandra, the victims who had gone missing in 1982, even though the identities they had carried for most of their lives did not reflect their true origins. However, even when the conclusion was clear in terms of data and science, completing the legal procedures still required a series of official steps to ensure that the confirmation was recognized by the competent authorities and had effect in all administrative and legal contexts. The confirmation documents were drafted based on the DNA test results, file cross-reference minutes, and related investigation reports, then submitted to the appropriate agencies for review and approval in accordance with regulations. This process was not only to establish the true identities of the two victims, but also to update and correct the relevant data systems from civil records to federal databases, to ensure that the newly recognized truth did not coexist with conflicting old information. Throughout the legal confirmation process, investigators had to balance the demand for absolute accuracy with the responsibility to protect the privacy rights of the individuals involved, because uncontrolled disclosure could have serious psychological and social consequences for people who had lived for many years under different identities. Therefore, every notification and update was tightly controlled and carried out only after the necessary legal steps were completed, and there was no longer any risk of reversing the conclusion. When the final legal procedures were completed, the case officially moved from a state of doubt to one of confirmation, marking the first time in decades that the true identities of the two victims were legally and indisputably recognized. For the legal system and investigative agencies, this was the moment of closing a long chapter of uncertainty, where all previous efforts from reviewing old files to applying modern technology culminated in a single enduring conclusion. However, legal confirmation did not mean closure on the human level, because although the true identities had been established on paper and in data systems, the fact that the two victims had lived most of their lives under different identities still raised questions and challenges that went beyond the legal realm. Nevertheless, at this point, the investigative agency's task within the framework of identity confirmation had been completed, creating a solid foundation for the next steps, where the truth had been named, recognized, and no longer resided in the gray area of doubt or assumption. Once the entire legal confirmation process was complete and the true identities of the two victims had been officially recognized, the next step of the investigation no longer concerned data, records, or the legal system. It shifted to the most profoundly human and sensitive phase, approaching the two adult victims to disclose the truth about their origins. The decision on timing, method, and participants in this process was carefully weighed, because the investigators understood that this was not simply about conveying information, but a moment that could shake the entire structure of perception and life that the two individuals had built over decades. The approach was carried out according to a cautious plan, prioritizing psychological safety and privacy, with the involvement of mental health support professionals alongside investigative agency representatives, to ensure that the information was provided in a controlled environment, where initial reactions could be recorded and handled appropriately. When the truth about their identities was presented, it was not framed as a sensational story or a dry conclusion, but as a series of verified facts, clearly explaining the investigation process, the reasons leading to the conclusion, and what it meant legally and personally. The initial reactions of the two adult victims did not follow a predictable pattern, as each person processed the information based on their psychological foundation, life experiences, and degree of attachment to their current identity. This resulted in emotions appearing simultaneously in various states: confusion, disbelief, silence, or the need to ask questions to better understand what they had just heard. The investigators did not pressure or direct the reactions, but focused on honestly recording the initial responses, as they reflected the impact of the information and provided a critical basis for determining the type of support needed in the next phase. Providing the identity information did not stop at confirming that they were the two victims who had gone missing in 1982. It also included explaining the practical consequences of this truth, from changes in administrative records to the possibility of accessing information about their biological family, while making clear that there was no obligation or pressure to take any specific action immediately. At that moment, the truth did not appear as a complete answer, but as a new question, forcing the two victims to confront the task of redefining themselves in relation to a past they had never known. The initial reactions were recorded not for investigative purposes, but to ensure that any signs of psychological overload, shock, or emotional distress were identified promptly, allowing professionals to intervene when necessary. Activating support was not treated as an optional add-on, but as an inseparable part of the truth disclosure process, because the investigators were fully aware that the impact of this information did not end at the moment it was conveyed, but would continue to ripple and change how the two victims viewed their lives for a long time afterward. The support resources activated included in-depth psychological counseling, legal guidance to explain upcoming rights and options, and social support channels to help them avoid facing this truth in isolation. Throughout this process, the investigators maintained a mediating role, not as emotional guides or decision-makers, but as guarantors that all necessary information was provided transparently, and that the two victims had sufficient space to react at their own pace. Disclosing the truth was not seen as the end of investigative responsibility, but as a crucial transition point, where the focus shifted from establishing an objective truth to supporting human beings in safely and controllably confronting that truth. In the first hours after the information was conveyed, reactions could shift rapidly, from silence to emotional outbursts, from denial to a need for deeper understanding, and this very volatility made continuous support essential. The investigators and involved professionals agreed that no reaction was considered right or wrong, as each reflected an individual way of facing a truth capable of upending their entire sense of self. Recording the initial reactions was therefore not evaluative, but aimed at creating a foundation to understand and respect each person's unique psychological journey. When the formal phase of disclosing the truth concluded, it did not leave a sense of closure or completion. It opened a new, highly complex space in which the two adult victims had to learn to live with a truth that had been named and recognized, but remained unfamiliar and difficult to integrate into their present lives. In that context, the role of the investigative agency gradually shifted from information provider to guarantor that the truth, no matter how heavy, would not become a solitary burden, but would be surrounded by robust support mechanisms to help the two victims step by step confront and process the inevitable consequences of truly knowing who they are. After the truth about their identities was disclosed, and the initial reactions of the two adult victims were documented, along with the necessary support measures activated, the subsequent process was no longer purely investigative, but shifted to a far more human and fragile phase, arranging the reunion with their biological family, the people who had lived for decades in a state of unresolved loss. Preparing for the reunion was not treated as a natural or obvious action, but as a process that required careful consideration from many perspectives, because the distance between the two sides was measured not only by time, but also by lives that had diverged in completely different directions, carrying wounds, expectations, and memories that were no longer aligned. Law enforcement agencies and psychologists collaborated to establish appropriate conditions for contact, with the top priority being the emotional safety of the two victims, while respecting the needs and mental state of the biological family, who had waited for this moment for decades, but could not predict how it would unfold. The reunion was not rushed or symbolic. It was built step by step, starting with indirect information exchange, confirming the wishes of all parties, and making clear that any meeting, if it occurred, carried no obligation to immediately repair or restore a relationship that had been broken for far too long. Contact conditions were established with necessary flexibility, allowing the parties to approach each other in a controlled space with the presence of support professionals to minimize the risk of emotional overload and prevent unrealistic expectations from causing further harm to anyone. When the meeting took place, it did not unfold as a single explosive emotional moment, but was marked by caution, silence, and unavoidable hesitations, because both sides had to face the reality that the people before them were both familiar and strange, bound by blood, but separated by unshared life histories. Specialists closely monitored each individual's reactions, assessing psychological impact not only in the moment of meeting, but throughout the entire contact process, from the first glances, the choice of words, to unconscious body language, reflecting levels of tension or desire for connection. For the two victims, the meeting carried a complex layer of emotions, where curiosity about their origins intertwined with grief for an irretrievable past, and at times, confusion in the face of deep affection from people with whom they shared no common memories. For the biological family, that moment was both the confirmation that the loss of years ago was not permanent, and the confrontation with the reality that the children they once knew had become entirely different people with their own lives, values and relationships that could not be reversed. Psychological impact assessment did not stop at obvious reactions, but focused on identifying potential signs of stress, guilt, or inner conflict that might emerge after the meeting, because it was precisely the post-meeting period when unexpressed emotions could become more pronounced. Support professionals did not seek to shape the outcome of the reunion, but acted as facilitators, helping all parties understand that reconnection was not a single event, but a process that could take time, with different paces for each person. Any re-established relationship, if it occurred, did not take the form of returning to the past, since there was no shared past to return to, but was built as a new relationship based on the newly confirmed truth and respect for what each person had endured. In some cases, connection manifested through small gestures, short conversations, or gradual sharing of information rather than intense emotional displays, and this very slowness was seen as a positive sign of a healthy process. At this stage, investigators largely stepped back from the central role, yielding to psychologists and directly involved parties, as their task was no longer to verify or conclude, but to ensure that any reunion was supported within a framework of safety and respect. Reconnection was not imposed as a mandatory goal, but placed within the context of individual choice, where the two victims had the right to decide the level and form of contact that suited their capacity to receive it. The biological family, despite their longing for closeness, was prepared to understand that their children's return to their lives could not happen immediately or in the way they had imagined during years of waiting. During this process, stories of the past were shared in a controlled manner, not to relive pain or evoke loss, but to provide context that helped all parties better understand what had happened and why the time gap was so vast. Thus, the reunion was not a closure or a complete resolution but a new starting point, where the blood relationship was acknowledged and placed in a different reality, the reality of people who had lived most of their lives apart. When this phase formally ended, what remained was not complete relief, but a fragile yet real network of connection, where the parties could choose to continue building or to maintain distance, depending on their abilities and desires. In that context, the reunion was not the sole emotional climax of the story, but a subtle transition, marking the moment when the truth no longer lay dormant in files or data, but entered human lives, carrying long-term consequences that no single meeting could fully resolve. When the initial meetings concluded, and the parties left the carefully prepared reunion space, the truly complex phase of the story began, because the post-reunion period did not unfold in a clear or symbolic moment, but gradually spread into the everyday lives of people who had to absorb a truth powerful enough to change how they viewed themselves. Adaptation after reunion had no universal path, as each individual emerged from the meeting with different emotions and needs, making the post-reunion state fragmented, where relief, confusion, curiosity and anxiety could coexist within the same time frame. For the two adult victims, the truth about their origins did not merely add a new chapter to their life story, but forced them to re-examine the entire structure of identity they had built over decades, from how they defined themselves to their relationships with family, work and personal values. Identity conflict did not always appear as an overt crisis, but often through quiet questions: who am I in relation to my biological family? Which identity truly reflects the person I am today? Does knowing the truth require changing how I live? These questions had no immediate answers, and their persistence created a latent tension, where the victims had to learn to live with uncertainty about themselves, while maintaining the social roles they had held before. Post-reunion adaptation was therefore not only about getting used to the biological family's presence in their lives, but also about an internal adjustment process, where every decision, no matter how small, could be reconsidered in light of the newly revealed truth. For the biological family, post-reunion also brought its own challenges. The joy of seeing their children again did not erase the years of loss, and witnessing them grow up under a different identity could evoke gratitude that they were alive alongside pain for not having been part of most of their lives. If not handled carefully, these emotions could transform into unrealistic expectations, unintentionally adding pressure to the already fragile victims. Delayed trauma began to surface as the gap between the reunion moment and real life became more evident, because what had been suppressed for decades, from the family's grief of losing children to the victim's unconscious sense of deficiency, could not be resolved by one or a few meetings. Memories that never existed became a unique form of trauma, where the pain stemmed not from what happened, but from what never had the chance to happen: shared years, missed family milestones, and experiences that could have shaped their lives differently. For the victims, delayed trauma could manifest as regret, aimless anger, or a sense of having been deprived of choice over identity and life from too young an age to understand. These emotions were not always clearly expressed, because they clashed with the reality that they still had stable lives, their own families, and cherished relationships, making it harder to acknowledge the pain. In this context, reintegration was not merely about bringing the biological family into their current lives, but about learning to place them in the right position, where the truth was respected, but did not overshadow the entire life structure already built. Psychologists continued to play a crucial role, not to push for quick bonding, but to help all parties recognize and accept that reintegration could be slow, intermittent, and uneven, and that this did not mean failure or rejection. For the victims, reintegration also involved how they shared their story with those around them, from spouses and children to friends and colleagues, because the truth about their origins could affect how they were perceived and how they wished to be understood. The decision to disclose or keep silent, how much to reveal and when, became part of reclaiming control over their lives, where they first had the right to choose how their story was told. Identity conflict at this stage was not merely a clash between old and new identities, but an effort to integrate both into a coherent narrative, where the past was acknowledged without denying what had helped them survive and grow. Some new relationships with the biological family progressed slowly, but steadily, based on respect for boundaries and listening, while others paused or remained limited, reflecting self-protection needs in a sensitive period. Delayed trauma could also emerge unexpectedly, triggered by life events such as birthdays, family holidays, or major milestones, when the biological family's presence highlighted long-existing gaps. These moments, though painful, also became opportunities to face the reality that post-reunion was not a stable state, but an ongoing process, where emotions could shift over time and context. Reintegration therefore had no clear endpoint, but was measured by the parties' ability to live with the truth, without letting it completely shatter what had been built. For the victims, this could mean accepting that they were both products of the life they had lived, and heirs to an interrupted story, and that both aspects were valid. The biological family, meanwhile, had to learn to shift from the role of seekers to the role of presence, where presence did not require compensating for the entire past, but respected the present and future of their children. As time passed, post-reunion gradually revealed itself as a phase that could not be shortened or simplified, where every progress was personal and non-linear. Identity conflicts did not disappear entirely, but could be managed better when all parties understood that reconciling with the past did not mean rewriting their entire life story. Delayed trauma, when properly recognized and supported, ceased to be only a source of pain and became part of the healing process, where acknowledging invisible losses helped build a more realistic relationship with the truth. In that context, post-reunion did not mean closing the story, but opening a phase of living with an established truth, where people learn to adapt, reintegrate, and move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by placing it in its proper place in their current lives. As the involved parties gradually learn to live with the truth after reunion, and the psychological consequences continued to be addressed in their personal lives, another question, cold and unavoidable, returned to the center of the case: who caused the disappearance of the two children in 1982, and could justice still reach that person? Revisiting old suspects was not done with the expectation of immediately identifying and prosecuting a specific perpetrator, but to reassess how initial hypotheses might be reinterpreted in light of what had been confirmed, and whether any individual had been overlooked or inadequately evaluated due to the limitations of the time. Investigators reopened the list of people who had been noticed in the early stages, including strangers seen in the area, individuals with possible access to the victims during the critical time window, and cases that had been considered but quickly ruled out for lack of concrete evidence. However, this review quickly revealed an unchangeable reality. Most information about potential suspects had faded over time, witnesses could no longer provide accurate memories, and many relevant individuals no longer lived locally or had passed away, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct the behavioral context. Alongside reviewing people, investigators reassessed the remaining evidence, however scant, from initial crime scene reports, witness statements, and items collected during the search. Yet this evidence, which had already been too weak to support criminal charges from the beginning, became even weaker in the current legal context, where standards of proof demanded precision and tight linkage that old data could not meet. There was no direct DNA sample from the perpetrator, no physical evidence linking to a specific individual, and no reliable testimony strong enough to stand in court, all making the leap from hypothesis to charge impossible. When examining legal barriers, the issue was not only the lack of evidence, but also the limits of time, as many acts related to removing children from families in the 1980s legal context were not defined or prosecuted in ways that modern law could fully apply retroactively. Statutes of limitations, changes in crime definitions, and the inability to prove coercion or violence by current legal standards created a wall that no amount of desire for justice could easily breach. Investigators had to face the possibility that even if the person responsible for removing the two children from their biological family could be identified, criminal prosecution would still be unfeasible due to lack of solid legal grounds, a reality that created tension between the desire for justice and the limits of the law. Inability to prosecute did not mean denying that a wrong had occurred, but acknowledging that the legal system could only operate within certain boundaries, where evidence, statutes of limitations, and procedural rules were decisive. For the biological family, this truth brought another form of loss. Even after regaining their children, they had to accept that the question of responsibility might never be officially answered, and that justice, in the legal sense, might not come. For the two adult victims, the inability to identify or prosecute the perpetrator also created complex emotions, where relief at having survived and reunited intertwined with a sense of injustice, that their lives had been permanently altered without anyone being held legally accountable. At this stage, investigators had to balance transparency about what could and could not be done with empathy for the legitimate wishes of those involved, because promising an unattainable legal outcome would only increase harm. Identifying legal barriers was not an act of abandonment, but a necessary step to place the case in its proper position within the justice system, where the truth had been clarified to the maximum extent possible, but punishment was no longer a viable option. In that context, the question of the perpetrator did not disappear, but shifted from a prosecutorial target to a historical and moral issue, where understanding what happened became more important than imposing punishment. Inability to prosecute also forced the parties to confront the reality that justice did not always mean a conviction, and that in some cases, confirming the truth, acknowledging harm, and supporting those affected was the most the system could do. When the suspect review and evidence evaluation concluded, it left an unfillable gap, where the question of who caused the initial rupture remained without an official answer. However, precisely acknowledging the limits of legal justice opened a different perspective on the case's conclusion, where the focus was no longer on punishment, but on recognizing that the truth had been brought to light, the missing had been found, and even if the perpetrator could not be brought to court, the consequences of the act long ago were recorded as an undeniable part of the case's history. When legal limits were clearly defined, and prosecution was no longer a realistic option, the 1982 disappearance case closed not with a conviction, but with a comprehensive summary of a more than 4-decade investigation, where each phase reflected changes in era, tools, and humanity's approach to truth. From the first hours after the 2 children vanished, with urgent searches relying on local manpower and fragile witness memories, to the investigation stalling and being archived as a classic cold case, the process clearly showed the system's limits when lacking data, connections, and supporting technology. The case was reopened, not because of a random new lead, but due to a systematic shift in how law enforcement viewed old files, not as closed stories but as untapped data sets. The establishment of cold case units, digitization of records, and cross-referencing of federal data created a new foundation, allowing investigators to overcome barriers that had kept the case stalled for years. In the overall picture, genealogical DNA emerged as the decisive factor, not because it provided instant answers, but because it opened an entirely different path to truth, where biological connections could be traced even when administrative identities had been changed and obscured by time. DNA did not replace traditional investigation, but supplemented it, allowing disconnected facts to be linked in ways previous generations of investigators could not achieve. The use of genealogical DNA demonstrated the power of science when placed within appropriate legal and ethical frameworks, turning voluntary personal data into a tool for decoding long-lost missing person stories. However, the case also clearly showed that DNA, while powerful, was not a universal key. It could confirm identities and blood relationships, but could not by itself fill the gaps regarding past behavior, motive, and legal responsibility. The ultimate outcome was confirmation that the 2 children missing in 1982 were still alive and had lived for many years under different identities, a truth of profound meaning for their biological family and themselves, while also exposing the reality that not every question could be fully answered. The case was solved in part, in the sense that the fate of the missing was clarified, and the basic truth of their lives legally recognized, but it was not resolved in the traditional criminal sense, where a perpetrator was identified and brought to trial. This partial resolution accurately reflects the nature of many modern cold cases, where the goal is no longer solely punishment, but restoring truth, returning identity, and acknowledging harm that had been silent for too long. For the biological family, learning their children were alive, and having the chance to reconnect, however late, completely changed how they viewed the years of waiting, transforming hopeless loss into a more complex form of regret, where joy and sorrow coexist. For the 2 victims, the truth brought the opportunity to understand themselves anew, but also posed prolonged psychological and identity challenges, showing that being found did not mean all wounds were instantly healed. On a broader level, this case held significant meaning for how society views long-term missing persons cases, especially those once considered hopeless. It showed that the silence of a file did not necessarily mean the story was over, but might only indicate that the right tools and context had not yet appeared. Applying genealogical DNA and interdisciplinary data, cross-referencing opened the possibility that many other missing cases, especially those involving children, could be revisited with higher chances of finding truth, provided the process was conducted with caution and respect for privacy. At the same time, the case raised important questions about the system's responsibility in protecting data, standardizing records, and ensuring administrative anomalies were not overlooked for long periods, because it was precisely those gaps that allowed the truth to remain hidden for decades. In summary, the 1982 disappearance case did not end with a perfect resolution, but with a complex picture that fully reflected what justice can and cannot do. It affirmed that truth, even when delayed, still held profound value for those affected, and that closing a cold case was not just filing it away, but accepting imperfect outcomes, while respecting the effort and progress achieved. For law enforcement agencies, the case became a textbook example of the importance of long-term investment in cold case units and modern technology, showing that what was once impossible could become possible when approaches changed. For society, it sent a message that every missing person case deserves to be remembered and re-examined, not because a perpetrator is guaranteed to be found, but because discovering the truth about a person's fate is a value in itself. In that context, the case closed not with a final period, but with a deeper awareness of limits, possibilities, and human responsibility. When facing stories obscured by time, where recovering identity and truth, even if incomplete, remains a meaningful form of long-term justice. The story in Hutchinson, Kansas in 1982 reminds us that community safety is sometimes only a collective assumption. The Thomas family trusted the small town, trusted familiar faces, and in just a brief moment of unsupervised time, Jessica, 5 years old, and Sandra, 2 years old, vanished without signs of struggle. The practical lesson for life in the United States today is not to live in fear, but to design proactive safety into daily routines. First, treat moments of absence as real risks. When watching children in front yards, parks, parking lots, or community events, set simple rules like always in sight, always in earshot, assign clear supervision roles, and teach children a short script. If approached by a stranger, go to a safe adult, staff with name tags, families with small children, service counters instead of following promises. Second, the story shows how paperwork can drift for decades. The sisters' records had inconsistencies in birth dates and documents that went undetected due to lack of federal cross-checking. For adoptive families, families with adopted children, or families that move across states frequently, proactively keep copies of original documents, medical history, and legal guardian information. If anything seems unusual, check early, through official channels, vital records, adoption agencies, attorneys. Third, the story highlights the power of modern technology when used correctly. Cold case units, digitized files, and used genealogical DNA to trace identities. In today's life, consider keeping emergency family information, recent photos, identifying descriptions, emergency contacts, medical records, and updating it regularly. In an emergency, accurate information in the first hour can make a huge difference. Finally, reunion does not automatically heal. Jessica and Sandra had to face identity conflicts and delayed trauma. Therefore, when a family goes through a major crisis, don't hesitate to seek therapy, support groups, or community services. That is the civilized way to move forward, not a sign of weakness. If you believe every missing person case deserves to be retold until the truth is found, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to follow and retell cold cases that have never been fully heard. Thank you for accompanying us on this deeply emotional journey. See you in the next video, with another story, where the truth may arrive late, but it is never meaningless.